Hi there, welcome to our collaboration clinic videos. In this series, I talk to people that are in self-organizing teams about their collaboration challenges and I give them some tips and advice. So I hope you enjoy the series, and if you want to have a call with me, just check out the links in the description. Thanks, Mary, for jumping on a call with me. It'll be great to have a little bit more background about you and what you do and about your team.
Yeah, of course, of course. So, as you know, I recently participated in your course about self-managing teams, and I was super inspired by all of the knowledge and also the way of working that I experienced in that course. And having just completed a master's degree in OD, it brought some of those concepts I was learning to life in a different way. And so I'm working to figure out how to embed that in my own professional life. And it comes up in particular with my workplace right now. So I work for a really big healthcare company, global, complicated, regulated, worthy, purpose-driven. But we're in the midst of a reorg. And what that is offering is an opportunity for us to rethink how my team of about 40 people, and then also how we influence our larger team, design team, which is about 200 people, to have greater impact on our global organization. So we're at this moment where I'm trying to figure out, Natty, how can I help spark conversations that really lead to meaningful change? And I think the team is interested in it, but it gets to this point where there's theory versus like what are some really ways that we could actually experiment differently when your way of working is so different than how we work today.
Yeah, great. Tell me a little bit more about the structure that you have at the moment. So you said it's a larger organization and you're in a smaller team. What's your role in that team?
Yeah. So I'm one of 5 strategy directors. I work on the design team, and I lead a community of practice in service design. So I report into a senior director who's on our design leadership team. And under him are the 5 of us who are different strategy directors, mostly based on capability and years of experience.
Great. Thanks. Yeah. That gives me, a better picture as well.
Yeah.
So in terms of what are the things that you want to bring into this organization? What are these change that you're talking about?
We are formally in the midst of deciding what to do next. So my senior director and the 4 other directors, we have had 2 working sessions to figure out what experiments we want to do short-term, long-term. We have 3 people who are working on some sort of future scenario planning to help us figure out what to live into. And then given all, we did a sort of like from to exercise, like here's where we are now, here's where we want to be. But it's like the super long list of, a lot of different things. And we're trying to, the other team is working on synthesizing that, into some meaningful areas of discussion.
Yeah. So, do you have any specific things that you want to ask me?
Yeah.
Like maybe based on the training, because you came to our patterns course, right? So based on that, was there anything that you heard there or that you experienced that you're like, ooh, this seems interesting. I wonder how we can bring it?
Yeah. One thing that's of interest to me, Nettie, is when we learned about decision making, and our group, myself included, has a tendency to always be diverging and not converging. And so things can easily spiral out of control because we're all idea people. And I brought this up the other day that I think we need new ways of making decisions. And we're a very consensus-driven organization, and it just isn't always very effective. So that is an area that I think could really help us to be more nimble, is to understand how to make decisions or take decisions more effectively.
Great.
Yeah.
So have you experienced with a few different methods? Like, is it consensus what you folks normally use in your teams? Like formalized consensus?
I don't know if it's formalized, Maddie, now that
Okay.
I think about it. Yeah.
Do you have
It-
a policy, like how do you make decisions? Do you have a policy in place?
No.
Ah,
No.
okay. So you kind of diverge to when there's a decision to make, it's like involving everyone in trying to make the decision where everyone is happy about it. And is that more or less it?
That's my perception, yes.
Yeah, great. And does that happen more at the level of the directors or in the teams as well, as you're trying to be on the project and deliver on what you're doing? Like, do you default into that consensus as well?
I would say often, yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Sometimes.
Very common, by the way.
Yeah, I
A
would say
lot of the
often.
teams we work with have that tendency. And
Yeah.
I wonder if you have tried some other methods, maybe not even in that organization per se, but maybe in another, something that is still collaborative, but that doesn't necessarily mean we all need to be on the same page in order to be able to move forward.
Yeah.
Like, have you tried the advice process, for example,
I
or
haven't.
moving more towards a consent
Yeah.
that is, like a halfway?
Yeah. This is one of my questions is I can tend to be a little bit academic. So I have a tendency to say, I can share with you all of these models, but I don't know that that always goes over really well. And
Yeah.
literally, we just had this meeting 2 days ago. So then I'm like, I better get some advice.
Great, great.
But I want to know how to experiment with some of the different models that we learned.
Yeah.
And I loved this little grid where people sort of say, I'm not aligned, I'm aligned. We had this little concentric circle thing
Yeah.
that was really effective. And I just want the confidence to know when and how to experiment with that more effectively without coming off as kind of being, I don't know, academic.
Yeah, yeah, I hear you. So maybe I'll give you like some of the recommendations that, what will I say to a client that is going through that as well?
Okay.
And how do we normally support teams, especially teams your size? So you are a team of 40 in an organization of 200 is quite big. So we normally say, start experimenting in a smaller, safer container. Like, choose one group that will be a little bit like a guinea pig space. People that are up for experimenting with new ways of doing things, and they get the mandate of the organization to say, you know what, in this, maybe it's a project, or maybe is in your 5 directors group, you can choose where is the level that you want to experiment in. And they get the mandate to try different ways of doing things. And when I mean experiment, means maybe like 6 months or a year, right? Like, it's not like, oh, let's try it for a couple of weeks and see what happens. Because change needs time, right? You need to actually give an experiment, a fair deal, and then you stop and reflect midway through, and then you adjust and iterate, right? We work with a very iterative model as well. So the idea is, sit in that container, like set up what's the team where you're going to experiment with. Maybe it's a team that you are in. That'll be ideal, as you're the one that brings the motivation. Like, you're kind of like, we call it the champion, the change champion. And you can say, how about we experiment? And you could decide together at what level. Like, do we want to experiment with decision making, or do we want to experiment with how do we track tasks, or do we want to experiment with letting people choose what are they working on? Do we want to set up new rhythms for how we're working and how we're doing things, right? Like, it's not trying to change everything at once. It's choosing one thing at a time, maybe 2, like depends on the capacity for change that you have, right? And try to set it up as, let's try it out. Like, let's see what happens, right? The safe to fail space. That's what I was saying as well. Think about what's the group and what's the cohesion that team has already. Like, ideally, you're choosing people that that are quite comfortable with each other, that they have worked together in the past, where the level of trust is fairly high. So they feel okay trying and failing. Ideally, people with a growth mindset or that are oriented to be quite creative and to try things and be okay if it fails and be okay with getting feedback. So when you think about it, it's like probably you already have some people in mind and some teams and some folks in your org where you can try this with. I will say, if you want to experiment with decision making, we have a really useful tool. You probably picked it up from the training, but we also have it in the toolbox in our website for free.
Okay.
And that's a tool about making a little mapping what kind of are the different decisions that you are making as a group already, and choosing a few of those to try using a different method. So you're doing it not just by, you learn about the method, you're like, okay, how are we going to use this method? That's important as well. But then you put it into practice.
Yeah.
And you choose a few of the most common decisions that you make and try to shift it, right? And that tool looks at the different decisions in terms of how risky and how permanent the outcome of that decision will be, right? You can find it, it's about making your own decision making protocol. You'll find it in the course or in the website. So you map the decisions that you're making based on how risky they are and how permanent they are. And then you choose different methods accordingly, right? So things that are more risky and more permanent, you want consensus because you want the buy-in of the people. You want to make a decision that actually people are happy to live with, even if it goes wrong. While if you go more into, it's not very risky at all, and it's not very permanent at all, you can move more into delegating that decision to the right person.
Thank you so much.
And in between, you will have things that are about make like advice decisions and or consent decisions, so you can move a little bit faster on that. And practice, what does it mean if I'll really encourage you all to practice the advice process specifically, because then you can delegate the decision. The decision maker will, check with the people that will be affected by the decision and that they have the expertise, but they will be the ones making the decision.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm so glad that because this is kind of in my head, but not, it's not in my body yet.
Yeah, of course.
And so like finding the right, I forgot about the risk versus permanence. So that's super helpful reminder. And I think the other thing that I'm recalling is to make explicit what the decision-making process is.
Yes.
And, like it doesn't have to be forever, but like for this decision, we're going to try advice, maybe.
Yeah.
But can it be that fluid?
Totally.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
As long as you have a sense of how the process runs, and it might be a little bit different for you. You can start with something more like established, like, okay, this is how we will try to make advice decisions. And maybe after like a couple of months, after you did a couple of decisions, you can adjust that to fit more into your context, because maybe the format is a little bit different. Maybe the tools that you use or the timing that you have, or who's the decision maker, right? Like anything that you try, you need to be adjusting it until it becomes more it becomes more fluid, that people like really get it, they understand how it works. And eventually it might be that you're like in the middle of a decision that is being done by advice, and the decision maker is like, no, you know what, I realized that I'm using the right method. Maybe we need to change to consensus because I really need the input. Like I realized that it's a lot riskier than I thought, that's also fluid. That's a fluid way. But once you understand how to use the methods and how to use the methods in that team or in that organization, then it becomes more fluid.
Oh my God, this is really fun, because all of a sudden it sounds so much less intimidating.
Yeah, right.
Even though I feel like I'm in a growth mindset, I'm like really wanting to do it right.
Of course,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah.
Also, like I'm guessing, like it's not just you, right? It's your team. Like you want things to go well for them. It makes sense to be like, I want to get it right. I don't want to fail them, right?
Yes.
So it makes
Yeah.
sense that you feel that way.
Yeah. It's interesting because, well, and I think this, again, this risk versus permanence is interesting because there's a lot of areas to experiment that will happen regardless of what this reorg means. And then some of the things on the reorganization, I think they are riskier and more permanent. So I think we have to adjust that a little bit differently. That's excellent.
Yeah.
Can I ask you one other question that
Yeah,
that
sure
I think
thing.
is related? One thing in the decision-making process, but we have a culture that we call nice.
What is that? Tell me about it.
It's that people don't always say what they mean. They just mean they won't say, hey, this isn't working, or I don't appreciate that you said that. They will just kind of we glide along and then get frustrated afterwards that things aren't happening. So we talk a lot about, a culture of feedback, and we have some formal processes in place, but like these in the moment things where we just spent, 3 hours in a workshop, and then I hear afterwards that everybody's assessing with one another, like, how did you think that went? Like, we have this culture where we don't always say what we need. So for the decision making process, I'm bringing it up because, like, how do we begin to shift that too, so that people are saying what needs to be said to make the right decisions, basically. And it leans much more towards, in my opinion, people not saying what's so to literally to be nice versus saying, here are the facts and what we need to do. So how do you have any suggestions in this area?
Yeah, I mean, culture is what I am more passionate about, right? Because that so much of all of these things that we're talking about, decision making, do not work if you don't have that base of like that culture set right. Like even just experimenting doesn't work if you don't have a culture where people at the end of that experiment will say, yeah, you know what? I don't think that went well, or that didn't work for me, or I think we could make it better, right? Like you really need to cement the culture. That's why I said, can you try in a team where they already trust each other and they have this mindset of being okay to fail, and they have this mindset of receiving feedback well, because it's important. That's kind of like what you need in the ground. Tell me how feedback happens in the organization.
There's the formal and there's the informal. So like in terms of an individual's performance, we have 5 conversations throughout the year, and they're mapped and they're tracked in a system, and 360 feedback from others. And so that's kind of the way that we manage compensation and ratings and stuff like that. And then there is all the informal stuff that happens on a daily basis. So, coming out of a meeting, were we successful or not? Or did that go well? That stuff doesn't happen as often, in my opinion, unless there's a problem.
What you don't have much is a culture basically of retrospectives, right? As what we call like regular retrospective, where you think about how you're working together, how the project went, how that meeting went, things like that. So then I'll suggest to start in this experimental team, at least, by setting up regular retrospectives. So a useful thing that we do sometimes when we come into teams and we set up, by the way, this kind of smaller team to experiment and try things, we do that often. Sometimes we call them the improvement team, and they are the ones that will experiment with things and then feedback back to the organization what they learned about it, and export things that work into the rest of the organization. But what I would recommend is to set up a rhythm of work, kind of like agile sprint style, if you don't have it yet. So set up what's your work period, start with the planning, end with a retrospective every time, and just like drill that down a few months until you get into the habit of actually talking about what's not working so well and how are we going to change it. And that's the important piece, right? What it could happen sometimes is people might not feel comfortable saying, I don't think that worked well, because they don't see a change, or they don't think that saying it will affect anything, or they might be scared of what will happen to them if they name that. So by practicing retrospectives in a safer container, then people get into that habit. And the first retrospectives in your team, they're probably not going to be a lot coming up, but the more you try it, the more things will come up to the surface. It's about trying things and people experiencing that those things work, that are effective, that they are heard, that the things that they name do have, like, that things can change if they say that it's not okay. And I think like it's really important if you're in that team, or like have people in that team that can model it as well, that can name those things, that can start by bringing it to the table. Yeah, you know what? That meeting was super ineffective, or I felt very demotivated by a particular comment that happened, or, you know, like modeling what are the kind of things you can bring into the retro is quite useful.
Yeah.
So once you set up that, like a little bit of a cycle, a little bit like retrospectives, get used to doing those. Then when you try other experiments, you also run a retrospective. Like you also bring it into the retrospective space. So it's setting up that culture more for the processes.
Yeah. Natty, do we need to have sort of like a retro for every meeting?
Not necessarily. I wouldn't bring a retro for every meeting. Maybe for meetings that are quite important. So meetings that are more, you know, you're setting up your quarterly objectives, or you're doing a big conversation on strategy. Things that are a little bit bigger, I'll probably do a retrospective after that. How did that go? And what can we change for next time, right? That's the outcome of the retrospectives. What can we change? And you normally focus on one thing to change, one or two things to change. Don't try to, you know.
What? Yeah.
Yeah. But for like normal daily meetings, I probably wouldn't, unless you feel like there's something that happened there. And then I wouldn't use a retrospective, but I will use more of an inquiry space to be like, hey folks, what happened in that meeting? It felt a little bit off to me, or, you know, like, and that's creating a bit of a culture of being open and honest about it, and being able to talk about the things that are uncomfortable. That is also quite necessary. Not necessarily needs to be a formalized retrospective for that though.
Okay. And then one thing is how, like, is there a timing after which you have one of these strategy meetings within which you should have the retrospective? So, you know, like I just had this meeting with the team. We gathered the leadership team, we gathered a couple days ago. And so it's been 2 days, but like, is it still okay to have a retro, or just kind of say, hey, what did you guys think? I could do it by email even, or chat or something, but
ideally you can do it live, because if what you want is to set up that culture where you can actually talk about it. If you think that something really important happened and you're a little bit scared of that people won't name it, then you can start by doing it in a written form. So people can write what was great, what wasn't so good, and what are the important pieces that you want to consider to change, but then do the change together. So you can review what was written together live, and then think about, okay, these are the most important pieces that we want to consider to change next time. How can we do that? And it's a group inquiry into that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No worries.
I have more ammunition, and also maybe this is knowing my learning process too. Like what you're sharing with me is familiar, but it takes me practice to remember how to use it. So
of course, yeah. And yeah, I'll say like for us, like our approach is always like, just try it. Try a few things. Instead of thinking that everything needs to be like a big change and that you have to set it up from the start and needs to be perfect. Like, just experiment in a safe container. What are the things that you can try? And what are you learning out of that? And then pass that to the rest of the teams or the rest of the organization. And of course, each team might be different. And maybe they try it out and it doesn't work for them, but they'll come up with their own solutions. Right?
Okay.
So I'll say, just try.
Okay.
Experiment with things.
Okay.
And then tell me what you learn, because I'm super keen to hear.
Yes. Yeah. So I know that we're running out of time. I probably need a few minutes before my next meeting, Natty.
Sure
but
thing.
two other things that have kind of come to mind. One is the decision has been made thus far to not bring in an outside person to facilitate some of these discussions. So I think for some of our lack of decision making, it's because we're facilitating ourselves, which is fine.
Yeah.
But it's not quite as neutral, and you're like, am I leading? Am I contributing? And everybody's leading. But what, I don't know if you guys do some of these simple, not a long engagement, but like, do you facilitate, like just do sort of like one-off workshops? It's getting
Yeah, we do. And it's also like, so the HAM is not just the two of us and Drew, as you met it as well, and the team. We also have a bigger circle of collaborators that are experienced on different areas. So we have a few facilitators there as well that they're happy to do like a 1 day off or a half day off or whatever is needed, for sure. And if what you want is more like, oh, actually, I would like to bring specific topics, like, why don't we train everyone on decision making on these different models? What do they mean? What do they look like? How do you use them? Just to have the language. Of course, we can also do that. Not necessarily a long-term engagement, but just like decision making or feedback or topic based.
Awesome. Thank you for being so awesome always.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. It's super great to connect again. And do please keep me updated on what's happening there.
Yeah, will do.
Great.
Ciao, ciao.
Great. Bye, Mary.
Bye.